Okay. Chloe,
So
should I wait for your introduction? I just unmuted myself.
starting right now. So welcome everyone, and thank you for participating this morning. I would like to thank the Laurentian Club Canada, Penny Rose, Elaine St. Pierre, and everybody else who has been helping us to spread the word about this lecture, but also about all the Four Corners activities. Reaching the English-speaking community in the Laurentians is very, very important, especially in this very trying time. It's important to also reach the people that are vulnerable and isolated. So thank you to all of you who has been sharing everything that Four Corners has been doing to interact with people online or in person. I just want to go through a few rules. I know that it's sometimes hard to follow and everybody wants to get in and participate, but just so that everybody has a nice lecture, I will keep everybody muted during the presentation. There are two options for questions. Either you write me a note in the chat and you ask your question if you're afraid you'll forget it till the end. And I will also save those questions and ask them at the end. Or you can just wait till the end and ask Joseph after the presentation. There will be a time for questions. If ever the time really runs long and we need to stop the presentation, Joseph can write an email and answer those questions. Like last time, Joseph had also offered that you can send questions by email if ever they come up later. So that will be the way that we'll be handling this a bit, just so that everybody has a nice presentation and is able to enjoy it. And also, very importantly, I wanted to thank Joseph very, very much for doing this morning and presenting this lecture on Laurentian influences. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to Joseph.
Thank you very much, Chloe. The title that we chose is Laurentian Influences. And it's funny that I started working on putting together the show and then went back and looked at the title and said, I'm on the wrong track here. So I had to modify it a little bit. This is going to be principally a story about the English colonization and the beginning of the cottage country movement. But just to go to the first slide here, the Laurentian Club began or continued a tradition that has started being used in lots of places of acknowledging that we are on unceded territory. And what that means is this is Algonquian and Iroquoian historic ground. And in fact, we don't really have specific treaties that give us the comfort level that we have in using the area. The colonization really couldn't start, even though the seigneury of Argenteuil was created much earlier. Nothing could really start until after the Grand Père of Montreal in 1701. Before that, you came to the Laurentians at your own risk. It was not territory of New France. I have to mention, well, you can see that I would say we're on historic ground, but we're also under an historic sky. And for anyone who's interested, you can actually look at the totally different interpretation of the sky. Now, I say totally different, but I'm exaggerating because there's a lot of similarities, even to the point where you might say, I wonder if the Big Bear began here or in Europe. Could it have transferred through the Arctic, through the Inuit, to other continents? Could it have been could there have been information like this that transferred across the continents long before we know? I also mentioned Stephen Jakes Bevan, and the reason I do is he was a fur trader who came up to the Arundel area, which wasn't Arundel at that time, and as a fur trader, long after the colonization had started in the St. Andrews East and Lachute area, but of course long before Arundel existed. Both he and the Algonquin that he traded with, their descendants stayed on. So I won't be dealing much with Stephen Jakes Bevan other than that, I just thought it's very important to mention as part of it, even though it's not part of the chronology that we're going to be following. I mentioned in this here that there was, of course, tuberculosis treatment in St. Agathe, and tourism and recreation and music and art, and the list is very long. And I'm concentrating, or doing my best to concentrate, on colonization and vacation homes. A lot of my motivation, my learning, came from looking for place names, the origin of place names, and how they came to us. And among those place names, I managed to at one point meet Patty Brown, who is a postcard collector. She's part of the Wilson paper family, and she shared with me a huge number of postcards, which helped me illustrate this. So I thank her. The first thing I wanted to do at the time when I started really getting involved in this, it was in the early 90s, and I realized that Mont Tremblant was becoming the center, the tourist center, and generally a lot of people were thinking of Mont Tremblant as the Laurentians. We had our son came up with some friends from school in the United States, and they spent a week with us to come up to ski. And when they went back to Massachusetts, one of them was asked how it went, and he said, "Oh, it was great. It was great being up at Mont Tremblant. We never got to the main station, but we skied at a smaller station. They skied at Mont Alta." So you can see that Tremblant was becoming a huge presence, and to the point where people coming to the Laurentians were coming to Mont Tremblant in their minds. That surprised me a little bit, and I decided that I had to look at what was really the fundamentals of St. Agathe, because I always thought, because I lived near it, that was the center. So I went to the Library and Archives Canada, intent on exploring the tuberculosis history of St. Agathe, and therefore trying to develop a better understanding. And I went through the microfilms, and I looked, and I finally found the references I was looking for, and this is what I came up with. Mont Tremblant Sanatorium. You can imagine how surprised I was, because here I was convinced that I would find a lot about St. Agathe, and here I was back in Mont Tremblant. The story quickly about the Mont Tremblant, there was a fish and game club that was generally used by the members of the National Assembly and associate friends and so on Lake Tremblant. It was a pretty remote area at that time. Still, Curé Labelle was beginning, but it hadn't really reached beyond the Grand Brûlé, which was the Saint Jovite parish municipality. Though by then had already had its name changed to Saint Jovite. And this is in the 1890s. Dr. Laviolette went to the National Assembly and proposed that the mountain was the ideal site for a tuberculosis sanatorium. And they reserved 200 acres for it, and then decided to go one better, and they created an enormous area, the first national park of Quebec, effectively, called Mont Tremblant, to protect the air around this eventual sanatorium. So Mont Tremblant Park was developed for the treatment of tuberculosis, funnily enough. But also, interestingly, when St. Agathe did start in tuberculosis, very soon after, 1899, no one mentioned to Dr. Richer that there was 200 acres reserved for that purpose in Mont Tremblant. So he fundraised and worked hard to find a place in St. Agathe and set up the first SAN, which lasted 3 years and was a huge factor in tuberculosis treatment for us in Laurentians. But I'm going on to colonization here, so I'm going to jump now to St. Andrews East, where English colonization really began. And St. Andrews East, as you can see from this plaque, was the home of Canada's first mill, commemorated here. The senior was James Murray, and he had to find some way of building mills on the North River coming into the Ottawa. And he engaged a fellow named Thomas Mears, a hydraulics engineer from New England, who came up and helped build the appropriate dam. Thomas Mears is a subject of his own that could give us an incredibly stimulating conference. He has a fascinating life on the Ottawa River, but he wasn't the one that built the mill. The head of the group that built the mill was Walter Ware, who also was from New England and probably found by Thomas Mears. Benjamin Wales was the first paper maker, and a number of other people who came from there. I asked Bob Rogers, whom a lot of you probably know. He's in St. Andrews East. He's a really important player down there, in my view. He's a wonderful guy. And I said to him a number of days ago, you know, Bob, what's the most important family you would identify with St. Andrews East? And he said, well, the Benjamin Wales family. And I wanted to know why. And he told me about Benjamin Wales himself was a paper maker. He was really influential in the early days, but he was also a musician, and he created an incredible amount of social gathering around the English community that was forming in St. Andrews East. As importantly, his grandson was the author of Memories of Old St. Andrews. His name was Dr. Benjamin Nathaniel Wales, and he was a very respected doctor. And he wrote this history. I cannot find a copy of it. As a matter of fact, I can't even find a picture of the cover, but I did find a picture of the first map inside, and it was just that it was a hardcover without anything but the title on it, because there was nothing to show. Someone put this instead. Now, Dr. Benjamin Wales' daughter, Julia Grace Wales, was a very significant international player. She was the author of what came to be called the Wisconsin Plan in 1915, trying to stop the First World War. And she was part of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Her concept was called the continuous mediation without armistice. Naturally, when the Americans joined the war, it failed. She was working through the United States, but she presented at The Hague. She was always in Canada, except for when her life was Canada. Canada was where she belonged. And she retired eventually to St. Andrews East. Another element of St. Andrews East that I didn't take a picture for was Sir John Abbott, who was the prime minister who followed John A. Macdonald, the Conservative prime minister, who was also in St. Andrews East. So you can see that St. Andrews East was pretty significant, even though today it's St. André Argenteuil, and a lot of the history is forgotten. In fact, that was a little bit of my motivation for doing the research. I was trying to find some way. I was seeing that the young English kids growing up in the Laurentians felt like they didn't belong here, felt like the English had become interlopers. And I think that's because of the French movement to Francify, if you want, Quebecify the culture and change names, and things like St. Andrews East, an historic English town, became St. André d'Argenteuil. In fairness, there was a place called St. André d'Argenteuil, as I understand it, so it was a merging that favored the French name. The same thing happened to lots of places, and I was concerned about the erasure of our history. So I began to want to learn more about it, and that was part of my stimulation as well. A very significant player who visited Carillon and St. Andrews in 1799 was a fellow named Jedediah Lane. His sister had married a fellow named MacArthur. Her name was Phoebe Lane MacArthur. And he went to visit her and discovered the incredible development potential of the Ottawa River in that location. He was so excited by it that he discussed with the senior and discovered there was nothing available on the Ottawa River, but there was La Chute, where the falls that were named La Chute for where they were situated on the river a little ways from St. Andrews East, and he bought it from the seigneury. Now, the seigneury made a big mistake in selling it to him the way they did, because they kept no seigneurial rights. So he had free use of the property. And what he did, he was from Jericho, Vermont. He began to sell it to people from Jericho, Vermont. And what they were mostly foresters. They were not people who could develop Lachute more than take the trees down, and that's what they proceeded to do in the first decade of the 1800s. So severely that within 7 or 8 years they were suffering from hyperinflation. A lot of them were just leaving, and the place was just a sea of stumps. They would take the trees, burn them, make potash, and sell the potash. You can imagine it wasn't an extraordinary positive thing for the area. Luckily for Lachute, a fellow arrived in Hawkesbury named Thomas Barron. He was a Scot, and he was young, and he married a young woman from Lachute, daughter of one of the people from New England, and he came to Lachute and saw a different potential. In Scotland, the Scottish farmers were learning how to farm thanks to Lord Kames, who was insisting that the property owners encourage the farmers in farming innovation to develop the whole of Scotland. And he began to encourage some of these people to come to Lachute. And within a fairly short time, Lachute became a very prosperous farming area. All those stumps became fields and became quite prosperous fields. And just as a side note, that foresting at different times extended all over the Laurentians, and we'll get back to that as we go through the talk. The settlers, Irish and Scots at that time, liked Lane so much that they named, not Lane, liked Barron so much, they named Lac Barron after him. And I just want to go back one slide because I wanted to read, sorry, I have to go back 2 slides. I'm less organized than I thought. Just to read this from G.R. Rigby's History of Lachute. He wrote, if Jedediah Lane was the founder of Lachute, Thomas Barron was its first squire. And the reason he said that, obviously, is that Barron saved Lachute. But there's another look to be taken through place names of the areas surrounding Barron Lake. And I wanted to start with down the circle below Barron Lake that you see where it says Gore. Luke Madera, who passed away last year, is a wonderful, wonderful helper of mine. I mean, he just fed me so much information. He was so knowledgeable. But one day he said, let's find the history of Gore. Why did they call it the Gore? And it didn't take long to find the answers. The Toponymie Quebec says that it was named for the Francis Gore, who was the Upper Canada governor. Francis Gore was the governor who was recalled during the War of 1812 because he had no military competence and he was putting the whole area at risk, and he was replaced with a military thinker. He was returned after the War of 1812, and he is considered one of the founders of one of the encouragers of the Family Compact in Upper Canada. It's hard to imagine that some Irish settlers would want to honor such a man. So the other option was Sir Charles Stephen Gore. Now, Sir Charles Stephen Gore's claim to fame was that he led a battle against the Patriots in Saint Denis in November 1837. Gore was founded in the 1820s, so it's improbable. It's doubly improbable because Gore lost the battle. And subsequently, when the war was settled and he brought his soldiers into one of the towns, the first thing they did was pillage it, and they had to be stopped. So he doesn't sound like someone that anyone would name it for. The story led to the Gore Petition. Now, the Gore Petition was just reading an excerpt from it, which I will read to you, answers the whole story. It says in it, it's a petition to ask for the gore for Irish settlers who were living there but illegally. They had been wandering. They could not find any settlement that had any room for them, and winter was coming, and so they settled in the Gore. And in the petition asking for the land afterwards, you'll find these words: "Thus, my lord, having wandered about until their resources were exhausted and their families overtaken by the winter, they had no prospect remaining but that of immediately erecting shanties to protect them from the inclemency of the weather and perishing, which they did on a gore of government land east of the township of Wentworth and in the rear of the seigneury of Argenteuil." So it was a gore of government land that came to be called the Gore. And it's a much more credible explanation of where the name came from. There was another settlement that began the same way but ended not as well, and that was Rawdon, which was settled illegally by Irish the same way as the Gore was, but there was never any time for a petition because it was subsequently assigned to people who had served for the British in some military capacity, fundamentally having the right to therefore to have a piece of land. They were assigned the same. Most of them were Irish too, but they were assigned land in Rawdon, and when they got there, the people who had been assigned the land just disappeared. We don't, there's no sure place where they went. They probably clearly joined other communities. The next place I want to discuss is Saint Colomban. And if you know anything about Saint Colomban, then you know this expression, going to the cross. The story is a little bit longer, more intriguing there, because Saint Colomban is the person we want to know about here. And Saint Colomban was a monk from 560. How could he have significance, one would say? Well, the story begins in Leinster in Ireland, where Saint Columba, by the way, I think that Colomban can also be spelled with an O. You see it with a U here, but sometimes it's C-O-L-O-M. So I've seen it spelled both ways, and I thought I'd changed my spellings to the O, but there you go. This man, Saint Columba, was a senior generation from Colomban, and he was a monk as well in Leinster in Ireland, and he was also a warrior, a fighter, and he really admired the Psalms that were illustrated and written by hand by his master in the abbey. So he copied them, which was a no-no. He didn't have permission. And when the church found out, he was forced to give them back. And not only was he forced to give them back, he became so angry that fights broke out. And in the course of the fighting, there was people killed. He won the battle, but he stole his Psalms back. After that, they acknowledged that he could keep the Psalms, but they would send him away. He had to go and convert 3,000 people to Christianity for his forgiveness. And the rule was he would take their abbey system. He would take 12 monks and go. And where he went was the island of Iona on the Scottish Hebrides. Imagine. And you can see, I don't know how clear it is in this picture, you can see a little bit of the abbey. They erected a St. Martin's cross. Now, the cross is called the Celtic cross. You can see that there's a ring around the arms of it. And there's some theories that suggest that comes from the Catholic way of trying to bring local customs in, and that would have been the Irish or the Celtic sun god. It was commemorated there. In the course of time, he succeeded in his conversions, and one of the people who came with him, Saint Colomban, became interested in doing the same thing himself, and he moved to the continent, to France, with monks, and he set up an abbey. And this was 560. What he couldn't have known, or maybe he did know, was that continental Europe had been invaded by the Tartans a century earlier, and all of the Catholic documentation had been destroyed. So the Irish effectively brought the Catholic history, written history, through their scribes back to Europe, and the Saint Columban Abbey spread over Europe, copying and copying and copying all of the writings which were safe, had been safe in Ireland. And so today we have the Catholic written history from prior to 560. But my interest in Saint Columban being more current, I was delighted to learn from Jack Berger one day that I should meet a fellow named Fergus Keys, who knew a lot about Saint Columban, and he sure did. Saint Columban, as we had discussions about the naming, all kinds of things. He's a wonderful man, and effectively, the people who became settlers in Saint Columban did so thanks to Father Patrick Phelan, who was a Sulpician, who was also from Leinster in Ireland, and he was asked to create a place for his Catholic immigrants, the Irish, and he did. He created Saint Columban, and the first priest, Father Blythe, had no church. They built a cross, and they would go to the cross, and that's where the expression came from. If they really needed a church, they would go all the way to Saint Scholastique, but ultimately they would the expression going to the cross developed meaning through that cross, which I assume, though there's no way of knowing, that it was a Celtic cross. All of these people spread across North America a lot like the monks had, and they became very well connected, influential in lots of different areas. And one day, word got out that the gravestones at St. Columba had been vandalized. And this caused an incredible coming together of the descendants who came back and restored the cemetery and restored the presence of the Irish in St. Columba. And that's what that plaque you can see is commemorating. Father Blythe was interestingly, the first priest of St. Jerome. Now, I searched and searched to find out if St. Jerome had any Irish connection, but I couldn't find any. So he was the priest. It doesn't mean that there was a lot of Irish there or not. That's something that I haven't really been able to, or at least haven't taken the time to find out. I'm sure the information is available if I look hard enough. Now, the third place is Millil. I don't know if Shirley Captain, if you're with us, but Shirley was very, very helpful with this one. She told me all about the family histories of Millil, which they called Mill Isle. And there was a lot of puzzling over why a place where you saw where it was on the map, very far from any major water source, would be called Thousand Islands. Well, it was a part of the augmentation of the seigneury of Millil, which started at the Millil River and extended all the way to there. And when those Irish from Protestant Irish from Northern Ireland arrived in St. Andrews East and saw Mill Isle on the map, it was quite intriguing. So they traveled up there and they settled. And when they had the choice of names, they kept Mill Isle for their town. Puzzling why, because they had the choice of other Irish names that would have been more appropriate to an Irish group. At least that would be assumed. But I dug and I found most of them came from the general, or some of them came from the general region of Belfast. So I went there and I started searching, and I found this information. Mill Isle 1. See it right in the middle of the picture. The Mill Isle on the map here would have been an incredible commemoration of home for them. And I also discovered that the Mill Isle is not the only one. There's another Mill Isle in Scotland, and that the Isle word refers to probably I guess a old Scottish name for a meadow. So it became the meadow around the Mill Isle. And so it wasn't named for Thousand Islands at all in their mind. It was named for the meadow around the mill. I don't know if they ever actually built a mill. It would have to have been a windmill as well. But in any case, that was another fascinating place name solved, and showing how the Irish and the Scottish were major factors in the early agricultural settlements of that area coming out from St. Andrews East. The next part that I want to go into is the vacation community influence. Now here, I obviously can't get away from tourism because tourism was a big factor. And but the word villégiature in French, in Quebec French, basically means cottage country. In European French, it means a vacation resort. But in any case, here it's come to refer to cottage country. So people who came from a city to live up here for weekends and so on were called villégiateurs. So, and you can see in this picture, you can see Mont Tremblant again featured very, very centrally. You can see Grey Rocks on the left, and Grey Rocks was another colonization story. The Wheeler family came to the Mont Tremblant area to forest, but they had a lot more creativity, it seems, than those Americans who went back to the United States being defeated by the stump fields they had created. The Wheelers went on to take advantage of the train for tourism. Now, when they first came to Mont Tremblant area, they came by train, and the descriptions of being on the train car was basically it was a train designed to the cars were designed to bring lumberjacks north, and so both he and she were sitting around benches around the center of a train car that could have been heated with a box heater when it was needed, and that had a major feature right in the middle of it, a spittoon. And the trip was very, very long, not like it came to be later. And they described that the contests among the lumberjacks was to see who could hit the spittoon. So it wasn't a very pleasant sounding trip they took up initially, but they flourished, as you can see in the as you know, in the Laurentians. And they went from colonists to tourism. But then I want to stick with the cottages. Oh, maybe I don't. The cottages were a dream that people had. Where that came from, we can explore. Here you see the different townships, and I concentrated here on Beresford because it's where I started doing my own work. So you can see Beresford right in the middle. And I've shown how Beresford, like everywhere else, was broken up into individual farms by the early surveyors. These farms were 1,000 feet by a mile, so you can see they're long and thin. And when the train came, people discovered these places, but long before the train came, the first cottage country user came in 1871, and that was Philip Durnford. He was the third son of Elias Walker Durnford, who had redesigned the fortifications of Quebec, and he was the only member of his family to stay in Canada after the family returned to England in 1831. He acquired this property for recreational purposes, and he went on to acquire a total of 1,800 acres. Today, it's actually 2,000 acres, and it's a cottage country resort par excellence, with 2,000 acres and 100 owners, and lots of shared backland. It's a fascinating and successful development which celebrates the environment. But in the meantime, this was his first house. We have a picture of it, which is wonderful. And the story goes that he came up Curé Labelle's road north of Saint Agathe, which was called La Repousse, the road that repels, basically. It was a big, steep mountain, and the people who had been working and farming in Saint Agathe were being encouraged by Labelle to go north, which seemed like total madness to them. But the road had existed long before Labelle, but it was just a track at that point. And that's the track that Durnford went up. And when he was traveling along this track, he came across a field. And in the field was a farmer, and the farmer was swearing, and he was swearing in English. And this really intrigued Durnford, who waved to him and got invited to a meal. And when they were eating together, the man described how he came out from England full of the promise of a farm, and look what he found, and stated, for the price of the ticket home, I would leave here with my family. And Durnford is supposed to have said, done, and sent him home and kept his land. It's hard to know just how true some of these stories are, but it's a neat story. All the same, it's worth sharing, and it's often shared up there. So that's the like the first really strong evidence that we see of second residence homes, though there's lots more. However, 1871 was 2 years before an incredibly important incident in world, or at least Western history. I'm sure it went around the world, and that was the crash of 1873. The crash of 1873 was caused by the Kaiser in Germany, who was changing their currency from silver-based to gold, effectively demonetizing silver, letting silver float free in value. And this caused an incredible crash. It just upset the financial markets in Europe and in North America. The United States at that point was on both the silver and the gold currency. They were both monetized, and they had to switch to gold just to stabilize their economy. The crash lasted, as you can see, for the balance of the century, with dips and rises. And if you compare it here to the crash of '29, you can see just how significant it was. It was a major thing, and it affected everywhere. We have these words from Dr. Grignon in St. Agathe again, and he said the years 1886, 87, and 88 were years of scarcity for our colonists. The harvest had having been almost totally destroyed by drought, frost, and grasshoppers. Great numbers of farmers, discouraged by such hardship, talked of abandoning their land and heading to the United States. Some of them, in fact, did leave us. The town council, taking on the cause of the farmers, went to see the provincial government and obtained a large quantity of seed grain. This godsend raised the spirits of our good farmers rapidly, who rapidly forgot the years of misery. Well, there was something else happening that helped them forget the years of misery, and that was Curé Labelle. This was 1886, 87, 88. By 88, there was already news coming in that a railroad line would be coming through the area. And this, they thought, would change everything. Would it? It's hard to know. It's hard to know how it would have changed. And this is another part of the story. You could see the rail line as part of a project to stimulate the economy, an infrastructure project. Everywhere was doing this. In Switzerland, there was a unique way of doing it, and that was that to stimulate the economy, they certain areas evaluated what was happening and discovered that English tourists were coming and they were climbing the mountains, and this was exciting for them. Skiing wasn't really what it is in Switzerland later. Skiing was just something that skis were something you would use in the course of your climbing up to the top of the mountains, but it was not seen as it was in Norway. So they hired Norwegian teachers and English-speaking teachers to teach the children how to ski and how to speak English. And that was their infrastructure plan, and it brought a huge amount of tourism to Switzerland and stimulated their economy. So while that was happening, sorry, I'm just gonna have a sip of water because my voice gets awfully dry, and I'm trying to find a solution to that. I've discovered that it's a nervous tic that's associated with asthma. So there you go. I hope that helps. Anyway, I'm just looking at the next slide, and I'm trying to figure out if it got out of place because I don't see why it's there, but maybe I'll figure it out. In any case, the infrastructure happened not just in the Laurentians, but all over North America, where the train lines were extended as a means of stimulating the economy, and I'm sure making a lot of the elite wealthier. Another stimulus that happened was the, the Canadian Bankers Association president George Haig and they worked. The Bankers Association changed the rules to encourage credit. Now, if you can imagine at that time, if you wanted to start a small business, you would find some wealthy friends to back you or family or something like this, and your business would struggle. There would be no secure financial security for you. This would give financial security through the banks. It also would give the banks an incredible amount of power and influence. But George Haig was one of these people, and so that was part of the infrastructure as well. As I say, I don't know. I can't remember why I had Grey Rock slide in here again, but in any case, it was. There it is. You can see a closer map. So I'll go on from there and not worry about it. I probably moved it by accident. In 1891, this man, Octavien Roland, came to Saint Agathe and he bought a whole peninsula. And the peninsula had been the property of the parish priest who had chosen it to retire there. And during the difficult years previously, to 1888, he was asked to come back and look after the parish because he was so loved. And he came back, he regretted it, he just wanted to go back to his home, his peninsula. But sadly, there was a fire in the presbytery in 1888, and he went in to rescue the valuables and never came out. So Roland bought his estate. And there's stories that lasted until I was working in the area of people who said that certain noises that you hear from the wind on Greenshields Point, which is what Roland's Point became, were the voices of the priests still living on the peninsula. So he came in before the train. The train came to Saint Agathe in 1892, but he was one of these people who saw that it was coming and got in early, if you wish. Others did as well, but we won't go into the detail. But when the train came in, more wealthier people, much wealthier people like Lord McGibbon came up. Not to say that Octavien Roland wasn't wealthy. He was from a very wealthy family, but probably he wasn't as showy as Lord McGibbon, who built this country house. It looks like an institutional building. It's still there today. Among the things that he came up to do were winter activities, and the winter activities did not include skiing. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Laviolette proposed Mont Tremblant, among the activities, skiing was absent. The activities that people could do, there was no mention of skiing. In the early winter activities, they would build trails. In the summer, there was, in autumn, I imagine there was fox hunting, a bunch of things. But what happened to Lord McGibbon is he got tuberculosis, and he was sent off to Saranac Lake, where he, through the rescuer, was cured from tuberculosis. And he met Dr. Byers there, who was from the Eastern Townships and also had tuberculosis. And the two of them conspired to come to Saint Agathe and build a sanatorium for tuberculosis, because McGibbon felt that Canada had to have a place as important as Saranac Lake, close to Montreal. So they came back and they built the Laurentian Sanatorium. The Laurentian Sanatorium, this is probably 1/6 of the buildings of it at its maximum. Tuberculosis was the world's greatest enemy. The estimates are from 1700 to 1900, 2 billion people died of tuberculosis. The population of the world didn't reach 2 billion until, now hold on, excuse me, 1 billion people, I got my figures wrong. 1 billion people died of tuberculosis, and the population didn't reach 2 billion until 1930. So you can see how significant it was as an enemy of our systems of life. when they wanted to do this, they had a huge argument with the town that had absolutely forbidden tuberculosis treatment or even people who had tuberculosis to come to St. Agathe, because the previous experiment was Dr. Richer. The building had burned in 1902, but it didn't stop people coming from everywhere, United States and so on, because they heard that St. Agathe was a place to get cured for tuberculosis. And there's lots of stories that come from that, which I'd be happy to share another time, but let's move on to other aspects. One of his immediate neighbors, and someone he went to school with at the Montreal High School, was a fellow named Mortimer Davis. Mortimer Davis was his father founded a store. He was from England. His father founded a store called Davis Cigars. And when he took it over, he turned it into the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada, and he became extremely wealthy. In the course of his work, he backed the Jewish Colonial Fund, Colonist Fund. These funds were set up for Jewish immigrants who were situated, helped to learn farming, and situated at places like St. Sophie, New Glasgow, and Le Macazat. Now, New Glasgow is another one of those names that got absorbed into St. Sophie, so the only ones that will keep these names alive are us. And as I say that, I should just mention that I'm a proud Quebecer, but I'm a proud English Quebecer, and I think that we have to maintain ourselves as a proud minority, and not and embrace that identity. But in any case, Davis had also funded another Jewish colonist adventure in St. Agathe, and it was a commune that was some Eastern European Jewish communists had bought a piece of land in St. Agathe and tried to make a commune. They bought the farm of a single family, and there's no way that single family farm was going to support the several families that they wanted to have on it. And they slowly drifted back to Montreal and basically abandoned it. So Mortimer Davis was holding the bag of the financing. So he gave it to a doctor who took over the farmhouse and subsequently banged a sign outside the door saying Mount Sinai Hospital. When Davis saw that, he started a fundraising, and they built the Mount Sinai Hospital that you see in this picture. There was a subsequent new hospital built in the 1930s. So you can see that these second residence people were starting to have quite an influence in the economy in lots of different ways, quite an impact. Just to give you an example, I'm going to jump to where I live, and I did some research a while ago. I live on the 6th Range Road, the middle band here. And I live on this lot here, number 19. I don't know if my mouse is visible to you, but lot number 19. And what I did is I explored who came when of the second residence owners, because these were all farms, active farms. And these farms were sold to people from away, not all Montrealers. And I'll just go through these years quickly so you can see this was happening. This is what happened here, but it happened absolutely everywhere across the territory. All of these farms basically sold. And part of the reason they sold was, in part, they were living a subsistence existence, and with a grubstake of money, they could set up a business, go to the bank, get some extra money, and so on, and have an easier life. It was how they imagined it. There's songs about it today, about how the great-grandfather had a farm and the grandfather gave it up. And you can see the sense of truth in that. But in any case, all of these properties just became second residence homes. And that's all the ones I researched. And one of the interesting things I found is a repeated mention that when the farmers sold their properties to these people from away, Montrealers mostly, they kept the compost, the manure. We were not yet in the oil age, but it was coming fast. And the oil age would make that seem to be a silly thing to have done. It was just compost. But they would imagine market gardens around their new homes, and they couldn't imagine living without their compost. That was the profit on a farm. there was no, they were subsistence. Money was something that they would struggle to find so they could buy new implements. One of the people who, one of the families who bought several farms, and you can see the name Lac Hague, and that brings up our uh, George Haig again. He couldn't understand why his children wanted to live in this farmhouse way off in the woods when he had built a wonderful mansion for them in Saint Agathe. Uh, uh, he this never satisfied. He built an identical house in Métis-sur-Mer, identical to this. You can imagine that one perished, but this one still exists. It's still in shape. And the reason he built it is his wife could no longer travel to Métis-sur-Mer. So he built, you can imagine the wealth of the man. He built the exact same house in Saint Agathe, kept the other one in Métis, and his wife could move into it without even having to think of anything. Everything was there. The kitchen was the same, the dishes, everything. Anyway, you can see. Another quick perspective on this is here's a picture of a farm taken from where I live now. There was no house where I am. We built the house on a field, and you can see the fields across the water. And this is the date on the back of this picture that a neighbor gave me was 1911. This is the picture from 1998. I just want to go back to the previous one. Take a look at the red trees at the top of the hill and then compare them to here. And you can see that the maple at the top of the hill is still there, but the other trees are all second growth forest. That just gives you some background into the changes that were being wrought by these other changes. And you as much as currency availability was an element, another aspect was the oil factor and the way farming was changing because of fertilizers. Changing for the better or for worse is not the issue here, but it was changing. This building in Ivry, called Ivry today, was called Manitou Hall in its last by its last owners. It was the home of Viscount Raoul Auger d'Ivry, and I mention it because well, it's good. It's his story is interesting. He was the oldest surviving male of a wealthy family in France when his father died, and his mother panicked because she realized she had two sons and he was the older one. He would inherit everything, and he wasn't mentally competent. So she talked him into coming to Canada and starting the name Raoul Auger d'Ivry in Canada, which he succeeded in doing because the town became named Ivry. But that's again a side story. He could live there as long as his mother sent him a remittance, and he was the lord of the place, and he was a very nice man who paid his bills, but he had no way of making a living. He never grew mentally past the age of 14, according to the stories. When his mother passed away, he couldn't keep all of his property. He had a huge amount of property, and he sold it to the Manitou Ski Club. Now, the Manitou Ski Club didn't have a lot of knowledge about skiing. It was very early, and they would come up in earliest stories of 1904, this kind of thing, skiing down over the farmers' fields, trying to make it back to get to the train to Montreal. But one of their members was Lorne McGibbon, the same Lorne McGibbon who set up the tuberculosis hospital. And he had met a fellow named Debaya when he was in the United States. And most of the Debayas came to Montreal, but this Debaya was in the United States. And he told McGibbon that he was going back to Switzerland. So he said, well, while you're there, find me someone who can teach us how to ski. So this is where we came to benefit from an economic stimulation package that began in Switzerland. He was told to go to Lausanne in Switzerland and look for Émile Constant Cochard. Émile, as a young man, a very young man in his early teens, had won a ski race on barrel staves. And the prize they chose for him was a pair of real skis. He became an expert skier and he kept winning races, and he was hired by the Swiss military to teach their army how to ski. When Debaya met him in 1910, this is where the picture comes from, Cauchon was very interested in the offer of coming to Saint Agathe and teaching people how to ski for this Manitou club, but he had to finish his military service first, had to finish his teaching process. He came a year later, and he did succeed in teaching skiing, but he couldn't believe that people really wanted to learn to ski. It was too new in his mind, so he brought bobsleds and things like that. And he lived as an employee of McGibbon and succeeded enormously in his work. And at first his reaction was, well, where are the mountains that he was used to in Switzerland? And then he came to realize that skiing on flat ground, like here, it was wonderful. So he saw the Laurentians as rather flat. But skiing just began to grow. And skiing is part of the cottage country experience. A lot of people came preferably for the winter to the summer, as the Huascarinis had done, preferably for the winter to the summer. Interesting aspect is that the mosquitoes. Anyway, you can see the ski train in this picture, and you can see it here again. It's just people getting off the train. And what they would do is what the Manitou Club people did. They skied as far as they could down to catch the train the next day or the same day, depending on how much time they had. And in the meantime, the Manitou Club burnt down and moved to Shawbridge, reopening as the Laurentian Lodge Club, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. Here's another picture of skiing on St. Vincent Street. Now, the main commercial street in St. Agathe. So you can just see what a different world it was. And when the first ski hills came in, you can see a rope tow also in St. Agathe. This is where my postcards led me. And then when the war began, McGibbon was much more concerned about the war than he was about Cauchon and his skiing project. And so Cauchon sort of got left to the side. In the meantime, he had married a young Swiss woman that he met, and they formed a dynamic couple. Her name was Leah Berger, and they moved to St. Margaret's, where they started Chalet Cauchon. They struggled during the war, but they did create probably one of the main people responsible for the ski train and for the trails that that became associated with Jack Rabbit Johansson. His group, he formed a group that hired Jack Rabbit Johansson. So you can see that he was a very influential person. Another player in that group was the Wheelers at Grey Rocks. And here you see people skiing down the hills at Grey Rocks. And if you look carefully, you see they're wearing ties. They're in formal attire. So that shows you the early days of colonial and cottage country influences. And today we have a large number of cottage communities, and this is obviously not exhaustive. There's so many that I can't begin to count them and just put some in fairly randomly for you. So I thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, we can keep going. I may have the answers, I may not. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was super interesting. If anybody has any questions, you can just unmute yourselves and ask Joe the questions.
It's always hard to find yourself.
Question.
Yes.
Lac McShane, where you live, did it used to be called Lac Tourangeau, and why was it changed to Lac McShane?
It was called Lac Tourangeau. Originally, the Tourangeau family had bought a property from a widow whose name has jumped my mind, but she actually had to finance them in the property, and probably more rightly should have been named for her family because they were the first settlers colonists, if you want, on the lake. But he was a much more, he stayed there a long time, and his name got associated with the lake until the recreational work started. And so something very odd happened, and I won't go back to the slide to show you the years, but a Father McShane, who was the father of the Irish parish in Montreal, set up a camp in St. Adolphe for children who needed to get out of the city. And the camp was very successful as long as he worked on it. And one of his supporters gave him a farm in St. Lucie, and it was the farm that was neighboring the Tourangeau farm. And and people started to call it Lac McShane. And for the oddest reasons, it used to have both names, but it turns out that McShane was a much more exotic name for the French community this year than Tourangeau was. So that's one of a peculiar thing. But another peculiar thing is that the Tourangeau property and another property beside it, all three of those properties basically sold to missionary people, either priests or missionaries. Thank you for the question.
When did it actually officially get changed?
Oh, not long ago.
Not long ago, no. Because when I was there, we used to use both names.
Absolutely. It's when the maps were made of the Laurentians, which was in the time I was working. So
okay.
The last 40 years, it seems like not that long ago, but it probably is a little longer than we want to appreciate.
Thank you.
Anyway, thanks for the background or question.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Am I speaking to you? No, I thought that was a fabulous talk, by the way, that I think indicates to me that local history should be part of the Quebec school curriculum, because what you did, I think, would make children realize how important their locality is to them. But my question refers to the very early days on the St. Lawrence. I was interested in the Fraser Highlanders. Some of them were awarded land on the Ottawa River, but I've never been able to trace if they actually claimed the land. That's from 1763 onwards, but they were there apparently before the Revolution. Do you know anything about the sort of St. Lawrence stretch?
Rapidement. Continuez, je vais finir rapide. Ce que tu tiens, je vais le finir. Ouais.
Okay, Vicky, could you mute a second? I'm afraid I can't answer you. Though.
Ah, le poulet. Tu entends pas?
Vicky, could you mute? Chloe, can you mute? Oh, you did. Okay.
I just did. Sorry.
Yeah. You are leading me to do some interesting research, though, because I have been thinking I should go and find out who those settlers were that were on the Ottawa River around the area of St. Andrews. St. Andrews being a very Scottish name, and see where they came from. Were they Fraser Highlanders? That's a really interesting lead. Thank you. I'll look it up.
Yeah. One follow-up question. Another consequence of that area is I read that Nelson's masts on the Victory at Trafalgar came from that area. Is that true? You know, we're talking about the very early days. We're talking, before 1815, before the 1812 war. Was that possible, or is that just a myth? Do you know?
It's very, very possible, and the reason is that the French blocked the British access to their pine trees by blocking the sea going up towards Russia and Norway.
Yes.
And they had to find another source, and that other source led to a lot of ramifications. One of them was the settlements in Australia, where they were looking for pine trees, basically to make masts.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
And they found an island, Norfolk Island, off the coast, and they found a great resource of pines, and they began bringing people, basically prisoners, to cut them. But discovered that when the wind hit the sail, the mast would break like a carrot. The trees were wrong, and so they couldn't use them. And these masts, we're talking, a main mast would be 105 feet tall, 3 feet in diameter, these were took huge trees. The next thing they found was that they had some in their colony here in New Brunswick and in the Ottawa Valley. Interestingly, the very first American independence flag was a flag of a pine tree, because the Navy had made it illegal for colonists to cut pines on their own property. The pines belonged to the Navy. And so they would put what they called the mark of the arrow on a tree. And that, once it had that mark, it was doomed. It was going to be cut down and taken for the Navy. And if it wasn't, once it was cut down, if it wasn't appropriate, it would just be left there, or parts of it would be left there, and it was up to the farmer to clean up. This caused a lot of rancor, and it became one of the issues for the American War of Independence. But in the Ottawa Valley, it became a boom. It actually developed the Ottawa Valley. So yes, it's very, very likely these things were floated down to Quebec City, and they were built into sort of a ship made of just logs and sailed to England to be manufactured into ships initially. Yeah. So a very interesting question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Great presentation. Really good. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If I have,
Joe?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Liz down in New Hampshire. May I ask a question from way back at the beginning? You mentioned a 1701 agreement that made it less risky for the colonial settlers. Now, would that agreement have been between the French and the indigenous peoples?
Yes. At the time, there was the 5 nations, subsequently 6 nations of the Iroquois, had developed what they called the covenant chain. And the covenant chain was a block of negotiators, a trading block, so that the indigenous people would all trade as one with the English. Now, the French did not acknowledge the presence of the Mohawk on their territory. So there was no peace between the French and the Mohawk. And in fact, the French insisted on trading with the northern nations and telling them that if they joined the covenant chain, they would lose their trading rights. So the covenant chain became an issue for the French. And there's a lot of background to this story, but the long and short of the story was that when there was massacres in New England that were not part of the covenant chain. And when the Iroquois people realized just how severe the British could be if they were upset, they realized they had to have allies. And so what they did is they negotiated with the French, asking them to bring their trading partners to the table, and they would find a way of all working together so that they would have another outlet to trade with. So they would not be so closely tied to the British, basically. And so the treaty was a 5 nations initiative, even though the French call it a French initiative, and it's really both. A good treaty is one that both can claim, but a huge number of indigenous nations came to that from very large distances and signed that treaty.
Thank you, Joe. What was the name of the treaty again? Did it have a particular name?
Well, I think it was just called the Treaty of Montreal or the Treaty of 1701. I can't remember.
Oh,
I'd have to look it up.
But that's a great background story, that it was at the initiative of the indigenous people as well. And so thank you. You have wonderful tales that you tell, but they're not tales, they're true.
Well, as true as this historian says, right?
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the question. Chloe, will I be able to send Mr. Allison backup information if I find it? You'll give me, can I have your email address?
Of course, we'll do like we did last time.
Okay.
And then everybody can get the information. I also had questions on the chat. So I had one question that was Julia Grace Wales. Has anyone written a book about her? Where can we learn more about this historical figure?
Oh boy, I have someone replacing Luke Matter. Who asked the question?
It was Michelle Sullivan.
Michelle, by the way, Michelle, let me just mention that Michelle Sullivan is bought a part of the Koshar property and is very, very knowledgeable on the history. But Julia Grace Wales, there should be a book written about her. There may be a lot more than I've found. I know that the Quebec Heritage News wrote about her. And Luke Matter was after me to write about her for years, and I still haven't gotten around to it, but I should. So yes, thanks for taking up his crusade.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, I read that a gore is a strip of land that got missed when an area is being surveyed. So due to errors in measurement, sometimes an area just wouldn't fit in and it was left there. And so it was called a gore.
You got it. That's right.
And so is this true for the gore, Argentine?
Yes, though it may not have been missed so much as just overlooked in the sense that there was different colonizing efforts going at cross purposes, and they left this piece of land out.
Okay.
Yeah, but thanks for bringing that up, because it's hard to appreciate, how such a thing happened. But that's exactly as you say. These people were lucky to have found it.
Mm-hmm.
Joe?
Yeah. Hi.
When you were talking about Rawdon, you said that a lot of the land was allocated to soldiers, and that a lot of the soldiers were Irish. Is that correct?
That's as far as I understand it. Yeah. There could have obviously been others, but these are people who the British had a system for rewarding their fighters with land, and there was a lot of Irish who fought for them at that time. And I didn't include Rawdon, so I'm not fresh on the dates and the details, but they have done a very good job of their history on their website, so you can find a lot more, and I can try to find out something specific if you wish, like whether they really were Irish. But my understanding was that the illegal Irish were replaced by legal Irish.
Okay, well, we can talk about this offline.
Sure, absolutely. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks for participating.
Well, it was great. Thank you.
Shirley is up in Moloria, and she works with the history of that area. And if you're looking for anything, I found Shirley to be an incredible asset to my knowledge. I can ask her the most obscure questions about that area, and she knows them by heart. So.
Well, thank you.
So, are we? Do we have any other questions?
I would have another question from Michelle Sullivan, or more of a. She would like to also read more about the history of the Irish who petitioned Gore for land. Any published works about this settlement?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can send you everything I know about it, Michelle. Michelle is Irish. She has land in Ireland, so she has good reason for asking. I will follow up with that. Anyway, you and I are in touch, so we will be able to get that one answered.
I just have one more from her as well. How the Irish Saved Civilization is an interesting book on this topic. Fergus Keys is one of the Montrealers working on the Black Rock Foundation commemorative park project. He worked with REM on the controversial Irish cemetery excavation last year.
Yeah, Fergus Keys is still a very active. I tried to reach him, but I didn't have an up-to-date link. I tried to reach him through his website and so on to let him know about today, but I don't think I got through, because I'm sure he would be here if I had.
Any further questions?
Well, I really want to thank all of you for participating and for your questions and for your interest. I think this is a really, as Mr. Ellison says, a really important subject, and it should be in our schools. I've offered many times to go to the schools and talk about it, and sometimes I actually get invited.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for doing this. It was super interesting, and we do appreciate all your support at Four Corners. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I guess
you all.
people can stick around and talk if they want, or should we all just go? We have our own lives to get on with, I guess. Okay, if there's
Thanks
any
very